Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here today. We're going to have a great conversation with Yoram Hazony coming up on his book, Conservatism. We'll also talk about nationalism. We'll talk about all the things coming up. So stay tuned for that. I want to thank my sponsor for today's episode, Gold River Trading Co. GoldRiverCo.com is the website you're going to want to go to. It's that time of year when you're probably wondering, what am I going to get for that relative for Christmas? Well, I have the answer for you. You're going to go over to goldriverco.com. You're going to pick up some tea that is American, non-woke. It has a lot of unique blends that you can pick up. They have a holiday blend, a holiday package you can pick up, as well as some hot cocoa. You can go over there, goldriverco.com. You can enter promo code theology. That's promo code theology and get 15% off your order. Just head over there if you're having trouble finding a gift for anyone in your life. They make great stocking stuffers, or just, buy a whole set for a gift for your grandma. That would be a great gift for her this Christmas. Well, like I said, we've got Yoram Hazony coming up. But before that, I also want to invite you to sign up on the Patreon. Patreon is a great way to start conversations, to tell me what you want to hear about, give me show feedback, start up dialogue on a variety of topics, and you can also give me prompts as far as what you want to hear, what content you want to hear, what content you don't want to hear. All that stuff can happen on the Patreon. So click on the link, sign up and support the show. That's how I keep great content coming to you. This content takes a few hours every week to produce. And so really appreciate your partnership in keeping great content coming through Foolproof Theology. Hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. Today on the show, I've got Yoram Hazony. He's the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation and the president of the Herzl Institute. He's a leading proponent of National Conservatism. He's written books on this topic. His previous book, The Virtue of Nationalism, won the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's Conservative Book of the Year Award in 2019. He's a graduate of Princeton and Rutgers, where he got his Ph.D., and he lives in Jerusalem with his wife and children. Dr. Hazony, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hello, Chase. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to be able to talk this way with somebody on the other side of the world. I've never been able to make the trip over to Israel, although those opportunities are often presented to me as a pastor. You grew up in New Jersey, though. Is that right?
That's right. I was born in Israel. I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, where my father was working for the university, and studied at Rutgers, and then my wife and I moved back to Israel, and we've been living there ever since, more or less.
Okay, that's great. Well, today on the show, what we want to talk about is your latest book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. And right off the top, here's the question I want to ask that I'm curious to know more about. I think for people of my generation, especially people of my generation in America that are living in liberal cities, there is a hesitancy to embrace the term conservatism or conservative to identify oneself, as if I say that, then my friends will not like me, or they'll associate me with some talking head on TV like Fox News or in a previous generation, Rush Limbaugh. And so how can your book, or I guess maybe, what would you say to these people that are definitely conservative, but they're scared of the label conservative because they don't want to be aligned with the Republican Party or something like that?
Well, the word conservative just means a traditionalist, and it in the first instance, it doesn't even necessarily have a direct political meaning. If you think about the society that is developed in America and other Western democratic countries since World War II, I think it's fair to call it a liberal society. And what I mean by that is that when people are growing up and going to school, the principal framework for thinking about public life, political life, is this kind of liberal framework where the idea is everybody's free and equal, and everybody undertakes obligations only on the basis of consent. In other words, you become morally or politically obligated only because you chose to. And that kind of liberal framework, it's dominant, and a more traditionalist view, which would say something like, well, we're not actually born free and equal. We're born into families and congregations and you know religious traditions into nations. That kind of a view, which immediately leads you to questions like, well, what would I have to do if I wanted my family or congregation or nation to endure going many generations forward? So that's a basic conservative question. That's the kind of question that our ancestors used to ask all the time. And as soon as you start asking questions like that, then you hit issues like, well, if children are taught to honor their parents, their teachers, their pastors, the scripture, God, things that are inherited, if they're taught that, then they're capable of learning from the past and restoring things from the past. And if they're only told, like, do what makes you feel good, use your reason, which are perfectly good things to say in proportion. But if that's what they're hearing their whole lives and from parents and in school, then conservative is for sure. It's going to sound like, like, what do I need this for? I mean, I know what I like, and I'm using my reason, and whatever I come to is fine. So what do I have to do with this inheritance?
Yeah, I can totally see that. I think one of the things that I hear in that response is obviously we need to have a better understanding of what is conservatism. So that's going to be one thing, but also kind of this attitude that really Disney's really good at, of just saying, telling kids when they grow up they can be anything they want to be. That sounds really liberating, but it's actually really crippling. And it puts a kind of like false a fantasy in front of kids. I know that's kind of how I was raised. Like, and my parents loved me. That wasn't because they hated me or anything like that. They wanted the best for me, and they wanted to say, you can go anywhere, you can do anything. They want to encourage kind of an innovative American spirit, entrepreneurial spirit, but a lot of times without clear direction and clear boundaries and kind of obligations that you have to tradition, that can lead people to a lot of bad places. And that's how we get into a lot of the problems with gender and all that stuff today. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I also grew up in in that kind of family. I mean, my father certainly spoke highly of religion and tradition, even though it wasn't such a traditional religious family. But the basic message was definitely, your job is to go out and find yourself. And I think after two, maybe three generations of this, I think we've reached the point um, where the inheritance that is being passed down has dwindled to such an incredible degree, and the capacity of young people to absorb it, even where it exists, is just minimal. And I think what we found is that an awful lot of young people, they get stuck. That I mean, this is basically when you read Jordan Peterson on young men, or Abigail Schreier on young women. This is what they're describing: is
Right.
all the guardrails are gone, and you're supposed to think for yourself. So they spend years and years thinking for themselves, but that doesn't mean that they find anything that's satisfying, that gives them direction or meaning. And and that leads to actual sickness and confusion, and sometimes just throwing themselves into very extreme kinds of things that they wouldn't have considered if they'd had a more rooted traditional upbringing and society around them.
Yeah, and I think what I see a lot of times is it leads to a lot of both personal and societal, what I call disintegration, where there's not an integrated whole. There's not a kind of fabric of culture, a fabric of a society, which a human, a person can rely upon and feel connected to others relationally. And instead, there's kind of just this cutting off and this free agency where I can manifest anything that I want to happen, and that actually leads to a really bad place for many people. One of the things that you do really well in the book is you really highlight the history, and you pitch the idea, and I don't know if this is your idea originally, or if you're where you're pulling from scholarship wise. But you talk about the differences between the political camps of the 1780s, and kind of how they impact our current day view. And I think this was the conversation between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutionalists. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the answer to your question is I have about where am I getting this stuff is my area of expertise is political theory, but I have a good friend who's a historian. His name is Ophir Avery, and he's a probably one of the leading thinkers in the world on the history of English and then American conservatism. And we've been working together for many years. And this one of the things that's difficult about talking about the American founding is that there is this kind of tradition. It's a 20th century, basically post World War II tradition, academic tradition, which says that America really only had one founding ideology. That that the differences among the political parties at the time of the American Revolution and then the founding are pretty much irrelevant. And what you get then is people reading the radicals. We could today we could call them the liberals, which is Jefferson and Paine. And when I say liberal, I mean a worldview that is fundamentally based on individual liberty and suspicious of pretty much everything else. And Jefferson's view was so anti-traditional that he wrote a number of famous letters in which he said that every generation is like a foreign country to the previous generation. He didn't think that we owe the past anything, and he didn't particularly think that we inherit very much from the past. And this view was rejected by the group that wrote the American Constitution and in fact founded America as a unified nation, which was Washington's Federalist Party. And people are probably familiar. John Jay was a key figure. Gouverneur Morris, who was really the primary draftsman of the American Constitution of 1787, and John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. So these are people who early on during the American Revolution, all of these figures began to understand that it wasn't going to be sufficient to try to use the current Enlightenment rationalist models of government. There was a constitution written in 1777 which completely failed. And early on in the Revolutionary War, Washington started circulating these long letters to his officers and to businessmen and lawyers who were involved in trying to fund the Continental Army. And they all understood pretty quickly that without something like the English Constitution, which had a strong central government, a strong executive, the ability to raise taxes, the ability to raise armies, the ability to negotiate foreign treaties and impose them on the country, without that kind of strong central government, there wasn't going to be a future for America. And that party was was the party that was concerned not only with with individual liberties, but if you look at the preamble of the American Constitution that they wrote, it has 7 different principles. The first principle is in order to form a more perfect union, which is an important counterbalance. Obviously, they all valued individual liberty, but the first principle for them, the first purpose of American government was a more perfect union. And so the question of how do we build loyalty among Americans? How do we build cohesion among Americans so that they're willing to fight for one another, so that they're willing and able to fight wars and sign peace treaties? So what's kind of been lost in the post-war United States is the understanding that this was a very, very deep, in many ways bitter disagreement between the Jeffersonians, who wanted a clean break with the English the traditional English Constitution, British Constitution, and the Federalists, who weren't simply, sympathetic to England. They actually uh, established the common law of England as the national law of the United States, and their views on religion, on national independence, on sovereignty, on the importance of tradition. All of these are on all these issues. They were much more conservative than the Jeffersonians. So that today, I think that when you look at the arguments between kind of liberal internationalists and national conservatives, which is kind of like the main frame of political argument in America and in Europe today, it looks an awful lot like Jefferson's party versus George Washington's party.
Okay, that's a really fascinating kind of segue into something I'm curious to hear about, because obviously you're suggesting that this kind of split, this difference of opinion continues on today, and it kind of helps us map different camps, parties, disagreements. A couple months ago, I was surprised to see Italy elect a very, what I perceive to be conservative. I think they have a prime minister there.
Yeah.
Is that somebody that you would identify as congruent with the kind of the statement of principles with national conservatism?
Yeah, look, she's not an explicit signatory on the Edmund Burke Foundation statement of principles, so I don't want to claim her to that extent.
Sure.
But yes, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is the first national conservative prime minister that Italy has had in a very, very long time. And she came to we had a National Conservatism conference in Rome in 2020. She came and gave a marvelous speech, and maybe the best speech of the conference. And at the time, her party was the third largest conservative, like right of center party in Italy.
Okay.
Almost nobody had heard of her outside of Italy. Nobody knew who she was, but she gave this absolutely astonishing speech with strong nationalist, by which I mean, not just identity, but also a desire for Italian independence from having their decisions being made by the EU. I mean, at the time, the EU was literally vetoing Italian finance ministers. I mean, members of the Italian cabinet couldn't be appointed after an election without the EU saying, no, that's a policy we approve of. And she gave this. It was both nationalist in that sense, also very conservative. She's a serious Catholic and pro-life, and in addition, interpretation of Tolkien, and explaining to us the way that the different nations need to learn to work together in order to be able to overcome our common challenges. It was amazing, and she's remarkable, and I think she'll be an inspiration to conservatives in a lot of countries.
Yeah, and I know she already has. I mean, I was talking to some friends that they vote Democrat, and they watched some of her speeches, and they were like, "Well, that sounds fantastic." And I'm like, "Yeah, like keep going. You're kind of on the right track." I think one of the questions that comes up, and this is popular in my generation, and some of my friends are this way, are kind of a libertarian spirit, where it's like, kind of like doubling down on liberalism, as a concept of freedom. And it's appealing to a lot of Americans, whether it's kind of the mantra "Don't step on me," or "Don't tread on me," or whatever it is. Why is libertarianism not enough to sustain a society? How would you help a libertarian understand, hey, that's not not going to work out in the end?
Well, the most important thing for understanding that it's not going to work out in the end is coming to see that it's already failed.
Okay.
I mean, I think 2020 was a watershed in American history and in fact in the history of democratic nations. 2020 is the year when liberal institutions across America began to fire senior figures like the New York Times, James Bennett and Barry Weiss and Andrew Sullivan from a different New York publication. You can just keep going, and that moment when being a traditional liberal, somebody who thinks politics is fundamentally about letting people alone and letting them have their individual liberties, when those people started being fired from liberal institutions, that was the moment that liberal ideas ceased to be hegemonic in America and other democratic countries. What I mean by hegemonic is that until 2020, it was you still had to be some kind of liberal in most of the major institutions, regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, in
Sure.
order to be a
Sure.
person in good standing, in order not to be an oddball and a weirdo. And this ended in 2020, and we are. I think it's now obvious that we are witnessing some kind of cultural revolution. One of my my Christian friends from Colorado wrote on social media in the last few days, how was it possible that we moved from, of course Christians like everybody else should be allowed to do, to live according to the way they want to, which is, kind of the old John Stuart Mill liberalism. How do we move from there to, no, you're going to build websites and create cakes to celebrate gay weddings, regardless of what it is that you believe on the subject. That's simply what it is you're going to do. And
Right.
that transition, regardless of whether, you in particular have this or that view on gay marriage specifically, but the transition from our goal is to let everybody live as they want to no, you're going to say the right things, even if we have to make you by law. That transition, that's a cultural revolution. And so the question, to go back to your question, why isn't libertarianism enough? Well, the first part of the answer has to be, we have to understand why it failed. I mean, there's this spirit of liberalism, progressive liberalism, classical liberalism, libertarianism, but all of them have in common that that they put at the absolute center individual liberties in one way or another. And we did that in America and across Europe and in other democratic countries for almost three whole generations. And why is it that worldview is not strong enough to be able to stand up to this woke neo-Marxist cultural revolution? I mean, we can get into it, but that's the main thing you have to look at, is if liberalism had been strong enough, if it had the antibodies, if it trained people to be able to conserve and transmit things across generations, then we wouldn't be where we are today. So we're going to have to understand exactly why that happened. And I think that when you do start looking into it, the answer is because, as we said before, because liberalism sends kids to school to learn to think for themselves. And that's a good thing. It's honorable. It's noble. There are good things that come out of it. The problem is that you send kids every day of the week, 5 days a week or more, and they spend all their time with teachers and principals and guest speakers, and none of them ever talk about God, and none of them ever talk about Scripture, and none of them give honor to the core framework that created America and Europe. they don't come out from that Christians. They don't come out from that Jews. They come out liberals instead. And it turns out that when you don't have that powerful uh, mainstream of Christianity or biblical religion as the framework in which to lead your life, when you don't have that, and everybody's thinking for themselves, well, guess what? It turns out that after 2 generations, half of them are going to say, I'm thinking for myself. I'm exercising reason. I don't think liberalism works. I think we need Marxism.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that over and over again. And even yesterday, I saw a story from The Economist talking about suicide rates amongst 10 to 18-year-olds are the second leading cause of death today. And I think that kind of atheistic or at least agnostic kind of approach to forming young minds is having disastrous consequences. Now, whether you want to attach to the kind of approach, the worldview itself, or the ideas behind it, or just the government impositions that have come up over the last 2 years, I think they're connected in a lot of ways. But I totally agree in their insufficiency. I think the case in Colorado right now is an interesting case study that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So the tension I feel on someone who has kind of embraced a more traditional conservative perspective is this. Okay, so I totally agree with you that libertarianism has failed, liberalism has failed in terms of now they want to force Christians to do certain things by law, right? They want to force this website designer by law to do this thing. So what does conservatism offer instead? Because I don't think what you're saying is we should go back and just get back to kind of a neutral public square where everyone's free to express themselves however they want. So let's say, because I think for some people, they're kind of suspicious of the national conservative movement, and that it's a movement of kind of, they would say far right, and they just want to, get all the power, and then they're going to control what people say. They're going to control speech. They're going to do things that impose other people in different ways. So instead of the kind of sexual revolutionaries, the neo-Marxists saying, you will bake this cake, now it's going to be either Christians or Jews, whoever it is in charge. Now they're going to say, you're going to bake this cake. That's kind of a critique I hear. Have you heard that before as well?
Yeah, of course. But look, it's a good question. It's not. I mean, it's not a bad question that people raise that. But the problem is that there is no neutral public square. There never was a neutral public square. I mean, there was an attempt to create one, but it was never neutral. It was teaching liberal values instead of Christian values. I mean, before World War II, the standard way of thinking about America, like FDR on the eve of World War II is talking about the coming war in his State of the Union address, and he describes Christianity as the foundation from which American values, not just religious values, but also American democracy, the capacity to have democracy, the capacity to have a world of independent nations. He attributes these things to the Christian religious heritage. That was the normal way of thinking about it. It's not until 1947, after World War II, that you get a Supreme Court that is, for the first time, willing to say, look, this is not a Christian nation. It's not a biblical people. It's a neutral nation, and so the separation of church and state in the Everson decision in 1947 gets imposed on all 48 states for the first time. Today people think, oh, separation of church and state has always been part of America, but it's not. It's not the case. It used to be that if there were a majority that wanted to offer religious instruction in schools, then they would do that. And I don't, maybe in some places in America it was oppressive, but the kinds of things that the court was overturning was like the Chicago school district that was offering in-school instruction where the students got to choose whether they went to hear a Catholic or a Protestant or a Jew teaching. And, it's just, I mean, I think it's just kind of absurd to look at that kind of ecumenical insistence that the children need to know something about the Bible and something about God is, and more than knowing something, is to feel that that's the public norm in which you grow up. Like, of course, there are people who are atheists. There are people who dissent and think differently. So they get to be excused from the class if they don't want to learn it. But the mainstream is going to be, a Christian biblical worldview that like America was traditionally. So yes, I agree that for somebody who thinks that you can have a neutral public square, it sounds scary to say, how about if in states where there's a Christian majority, or at least a pro-Christian majority, like people who see what's coming, they see the woke neo-Marxism coming, they see, you know what, instead of that, how about if we just try something more traditional? In those states where there's a majority that's willing to have that kind of public culture, that's willing to have, the 10 Commandments as a symbol on public property instead of bulldozing it. So if people think that you can have a neutral public square, then any kind of biblical value is going to feel like an imposition. But I don't see how that's different from what people are experiencing now. I mean, the circumstances for Christianity and biblical values in America are that it's all right for the state of Colorado to try to stamp these things out, to try to use government to eliminate them. And I think this should teach people that there's nothing neutral. It's just a myth. You have to choose, what's going to be the normative default value system. And then I completely agree that, I'm, an Orthodox Jew myself, and the question of, how do you allow minorities to not have to be educated or to participate in things that they don't want to? That's a crucial question. It needs to be debated, but it can't be that question comes instead of the question of what is the values framework for a state in which the majority of people are not ready for cultural revolution.
That's right. That makes sense to me. I'm curious, just personally, when we talk about these things, and when I attended National Conservatism, NatCon in Miami, I was surprised because you being Jewish, are such a fan of Christianity in America. Tell me more about what kind of inspires you and why you're such an advocate for Christianity in America.
Well, to begin with, I'm a big fan of Scripture, and Christianity is a very, very broad tent, and there are many, many different kinds of Christians, and I think you could say that this is a tremendous overgeneralization, but I think it's a little bit useful. I think pretty much almost every Christian denomination that I'm familiar with is split between people who consider the Old Testament not just doctrinally, to be a part of Scripture, but people who study the Old Testament and take it seriously as something that has an important teaching for people living today. That's on the one hand, and then others who say no, basically the New Testament came in order to liberate us from the Old Testament. And the difference between these two kinds of people, it largely correlates, it tracks with the way they think about the public sphere, because the Old Testament is it's a book about a nation. It's a book about a people seeking independence, and that nation's relationship to God, that nation's relationship to law, that nation's relationship to civil disorder and to invasions from other countries. There is political material in the New Testament as well, but the Old Testament is really a book about running a nation in this in this world. It's just not focused on questions of eternal life for the individual. And so, look, for me, um, I, I I become enthusiastic when when I'm uh, talking with and working with shoulder to shoulder with those kinds of Christians who still think the Old Testament is of great value. Those are people who I find that I have a strong common language with. It's true that, look, that there are many things that distinguish Judaism and Christianity. They are two different religions, but they are sister religions. And when when I speak as a Jew about the place of an independent nation, and its relation as a nation with God, I find that those Christians who really care about the Old Testament, they know almost exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And it's not just me cheering them; they're cheering me, and uh, they often are friends to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel as a consequence of their correctly understanding what Old Testament teaches. And I look, it's definitely more difficult for me, when I'm dealing with those kinds of Christians who say, um, you know, the Bible's a very big book, and you don't really, have to study all of it. You'll be surprised there are people who actually say this. That look, the Gospels are important. Some Psalms, passages, Isaiah. That's the core of Christianity. And there's way too many people saying that, and I have a hard time with that. I do. I feel like Christianity, when it cuts itself off from the Old Testament, it has this tendency to kind of float away from crucial discussions about how we need to live on this earth.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I also enjoy the Old Testament for those reasons. And when I study historical Christianity and just Christian tradition, I see people pulling from the Old Testament in a way that would make many people uncomfortable today in terms of how they apply the scriptures to their kind of either current circumstances, their environmental circumstances, politics, all that kind of thing. Uh, Question regarding conservatism, because I think one of the things I love about your approach, your book, is your deep conviction, and that it's obviously very principled, very well thought out, and robust. And what makes people uneasy about that sometimes is it seems to be uncompromising, which I admire. I think is great. Let's all be uncompromising on our convictions. But what a lot of people see it as almost a failed project from the start, from a pragmatic standpoint, because it's so uncompromising. How are we to then work with what is currently in power? If we have kind of this neo-Marxist revolution that's taken over the institutions, educational, politics, all this kind of thing, even the Republican Party itself, and we could talk about populism and that if we want, but if we look at kind of the landscape, particularly in America, how could conservatism succeed given that it's so kind of like dedicated to its principles and not willing to compromise with what is? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, sure. Look, my books, when I write a book, one of my main goals is to allow the reader to see what I'm seeing in a clear way. Okay, I mean, it doesn't help if somebody is slogging through the book and it's if it's so nuanced that you just can't get a clear picture, then it just doesn't it doesn't help people so much. So I would draw a distinction between what you find in a book and the political practice of I mean, politics is about coalitions, and coalitions are about compromises. And I, in my work in the National Conservatism movement, what we're doing is coalition building. I mean, that's the name of the game. There has to be a coalition which is most, it's not only going to be Protestants, and it's not only going to be Christians. That you have to be able to bring in other people, both people from other minority faith traditions, but also people who are, they're just moral people. They don't, they haven't been raised with God and Scripture, but they have strong moral intuitions on important things. You've got to be able to build bridges with those people. Now, I do want to make a distinction between conservatism and liberalism, because some of the most important people fighting against the woke tidal wave now, they're not conservative in pretty much any way that I would call conservative. I mean, they're not traditional people. They're people whose concern is freedom of speech, freedom of religion. A lot of them are people who are who are very, very concerned with gay rights and other things that are important to liberals. Now, liberal anti-Marxists, those liberals, those brave people who are willing to risk everything, their income and their livelihood and their good name, to fight against this, this plague, those people deserve our admiration. But I do think it's important that we don't mix the identity of a movement that is concerned to do what practically can be done to bring God and Scripture back into those places where it's possible. That should not be confused with good liberals who are fighting a great fight, who should be our allies on the things we can agree about. But that doesn't mean that we need a fusion of identities. Sometimes in the conservative movement, you hear this term fusionism, which means that really what we want is liberalism and conservatism to become one thing. And I really think that's a terrible mistake. And look, we're talking a little bit about Judaism and Christianity here. We can be friends and we can be allies and we can be close friends and close allies. But if we try to create a fusion between Christianity and Judaism, we're going to destroy both of those religions. There's no way to do that without just wrecking the substance of these traditional faiths. So in the same way, we can be allied with liberals on those issues on which we agree. And we're going to have to compromise with them in order to create a coalition that's going to be a winning coalition. But we need to be able to tell the difference between a conservative and a liberal. These are two different worldviews, and you cannot fuse them without destroying both of them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I've seen that with Barry Weiss as a good example, because she's doing great work. I've got people in my church that'll listen to her podcast, and they're like, she's saying what you're saying, Chase. She's right in line. And I'm like, I'm a big fan of what she's writing about and how she's fighting back. But I always try to delineate for people, I'm not trying to be divisive, but I'm trying to get rid of the illusion and the fantasy that there's more in common. When there's a common cause we're fighting, but we can't create a fusion between this. We can be useful, we can work together, we can be allies, but that's a really helpful distinction to make there. Kind of my last question involves populism. As kind of a political movement, populism is kind of what I think a lot of people associate with Trump and other political figures. How is populism different than conservatism?
Well, the term populism, it's a class war kind of a term, because what it's talking about, it's referring to a struggle between the broad public and the elites. And I definitely think that we need to be skeptical about that. I mean, I certainly agree that at this particular moment, the elites in America, as in other democratic countries, have to a significant degree just gone off the rails. And so there is kind of an element of a class struggle in the political atmosphere. But I think look, the reason I use the word nationalism and focus on the nation is because I think it's important to remember that you cannot have a healthy nation unless there is a collaboration between educated and wealthy elites on the one hand, and the broader public. If one side or the other is in charge, then you'll end up with a tyranny. And a healthy nation has negotiated an appropriate collaboration between the different sectors. So populism, it may be what is needed at the moment, but I don't think that should be embraced as any kind of ideal. The fact that the broad public has more common sense right now than the elites doesn't mean that that's a permanent, eternal condition. Sometimes the elites are right and the populace is wrong. In this case, probably not. But I think we have to think a lot more in terms of, ideally what we want is more of that old federalist spirit of forming a more perfect union, which is bringing people together. Even if we right now are in a bitter struggle between different sectors, ultimately the only way to have a democracy and the only way to have a flourishing nation is going to be with some kind of loyalty between the classes. Maybe you can't see it today, but in the future, God willing.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. I want to make sure I promote the book here at the end. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. Conservatism, a Rediscovery. You can find it anywhere books are sold. Is there anywhere else that people should find content that we haven't talked about, Dr. Hazony?
Yeah, aside from my book, that you can go to nationalconservatism.org, which is the clearinghouse website for the NatCon movement, and there you can find constantly being updated recommendations for books, essays, videos. Beyond my books, there's a lot of other really good stuff being written in the NatCon sphere these days, and worth checking it out. Nationalconservatism.org.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Sure. See you again.
Yeah. If you're a listener and you enjoyed this show, I would love a great rating. Subscribe, share it. I'll put the links in the show notes. You can share those as well. But I'd love it if you could share this with somebody, whether a relative, a friend, who maybe you've never talked about politics before. And this could be a great kind of introduction to have these conversations. Just remember, I've got a sponsor for today's episode, goldriverco.com. You can go over there, use the promo code theology for 15% off. And we will see you next time.